Call of Duty Black Ops 2. This phrase alone probably invokes so much nostalgia in you that is a pleasant reminder about how simple life used to be at the time. Black Ops 2 came out in 2012. The game is basically a decade old at this point, and I was 14 years old when this game was first introduced to the world. I'm 24 now, and life is exceptionally different, as I'm sure is the case for all of you as well. What is it about Black Ops 2 that makes the game so special, though? On the surface, Black Ops 2 is just another run-of-the-mill Call of Duty game with the standard offering of a single-player campaign, traditional COD multiplayer, and, of course, zombies. The game is looked at by nearly everyone these days with a sheer reverence for it and fond memories of each element. In fact, I literally started my YouTube channel on this very game. It sparked my love and interest for creating content, and I certainly would not be here today without it. But what I'm curious about is finding out whether we truly loved Black Ops 2 because it was genuinely a good video game, or were we in love with the relative simplicity of our lives at the time? It's a hard question to answer, and to some extent, I think it's impossible to entirely remove the nostalgia from analyzing this game objectively, but I'm going to do my best to do that anyways. After considering all of the parts of Black Ops 2 deeply, whether you liked or disliked the game, it's fair to say that there will never be another game quite like it. Black Ops 2 was what some would probably consider to be the pinnacle of the COD franchise, the peak of the series, if you will. To some degree, that depends on your perspective on whether BO2 truly was the peak for COD, but it doesn't really matter. In any case, it at least made an impression on everyone's mind so deeply that it's still talked about even to this day. That is certainly not the case for every COD game, and this already indicates to me that Black Ops 2 truly brought something unique and new to the table that will stick with us for the rest of our lives. In my opinion, Black Ops 2 is a lot like Jennifer Aniston. It most likely represents a big part of your childhood or past if you watched Friends on TV, and it's also one of the most gracefully aged things on planet Earth. At least in the sense that most of the gameplay mechanics, direction, and core gameplay are still very palatable in 2022, and in the context of modern day video games, Black Ops 2 even now isn't too far off from what would be considered acceptable in my opinion. I see BO2 as a genuine sequel to Black Ops 1, and not just in the story sense, but in how the gameplay evolved over time. Treyarch set out to make Black Ops 2 the most ambitious COD game to date at the time, and it seems like they achieved it. It's worth noting that not everything paid off, however. There are some aspects of Black Ops 2 that definitely do fall apart under scrutiny, but as an overall package is extremely well executed. And as far as single player goes, Black Ops 2 did one of the more interesting things I've seen from a COD game maybe ever. Instead of being a one and done, on the rails narrative experience, they introduced some RPG elements alongside the classic campaign format to make a branching pathway story arc structure where the things you do in-game actually matter in a big way and can vastly affect the outcome. And while the gameplay of the Strike Force missions weren't terribly fun, it all added to the experience that was the Black Ops 2 arc. We will get to campaign in more detail momentarily, but as far as the multiplayer side of things go, it seems they set out to make the most engaging and viscerally fun experience possible, taking the core gameplay of the Black Ops Arena multiplayer, but expanding it and deepening it further to give the player the most variety of experiences possible for the hardcore players and the casuals alike. Black Ops 2 multiplayer seems to be just as memorable to people as something like COD 4 or Modern Warfare 2 multiplayer as well. I really can't find anyone that hasn't at least played or enjoyed BO2 multiplayer at one point in time or another. It's an experience we all share, it seems, and with zombies, well, you can tell they had a big vision for what this mode could be, and they took some extreme risks with this iteration, and again, not all of those risks quite paid off. But honestly, in some cases, I think the flaws in Black Ops 2, and I'm talking the game as a whole, are actually what make this game beautiful to me. The game isn't perfect, far from it in fact, but you don't even want it to be a perfect game. It's insanely fun and enjoyable, and partly that is a direct result of some of its flaws. And if that doesn't make any sense to you, stick with me. I promise that will make sense by the end of this. Black Ops 2 has the sense in literally every element of its core game that sticks in your memory. Everything from the campaign to MP and zombies all have these unique qualities. While not all of them are good, at least remain in your mind. But let's get down to it and figure out why Black Ops 2 is so special among the COD franchise, starting with the single-player campaign. Hey there, real quick, before we continue any further, I'm going to be making a review video like this for every single Call of Duty title, and obviously these take a long time to produce. So getting footage for multiplayer lobbies, I'm actually going to be playing multiplayer with members, so if you guys want to support this kind of content and become a channel member, not only does it help out a ton, but I'll also be playing with you guys as I go and get footage and re-review and visit some older Call of Duty games. So if you want to take part in that, you can become a member, and it would be greatly appreciated. Otherwise, no pressure. If you don't want to do that, the least you can do is subscribe to the channel for more of these reviews, and it shows that around 80% of you guys aren't currently subbed, and we are getting really close to 500,000, so make sure to hit that sub button if you haven't already. But anyways, let's continue.
Okay, and
Alright, I'm just gonna come out and say it. Black Ops 2 probably has my favorite COD campaign possibly ever. It's certainly flawed, yes, but it's so charming and gracefully aged otherwise that it's so easy to overlook the glaring flaws. The basic premise of the campaign is both a journey back in time in which you play through the stories of Frank Woods and his operations with Alex Mason as they try and capture targets. Frank Woods was tortured by Raul Menendez and wants revenge. Through an unfortunate error, Frank Woods also ends up causing the death of Raul Menendez's sister, which causes their hatred for one another to deepen even further. The structure per mission involves cutting back and forth between current day, where you play primarily as David Mason, Alex's son, and try to stop Raul Menendez and his plan for Cortes DA. In a premise where Raul is primarily focused on cyber-like warfare, which is creepily similar to our current day, despite being a 10-year-old game, is oddly relevant even now. Not only does the cutting back and forth between time periods help illustrate the storytelling very well, but it also keeps it visually and thematically interesting, so one thing never gets played out for too long. As soon as you're getting bored of the Frank Woods stuff in the past, bam, cuts right back to present day with David Mason and all the futuristic tech and settings. As soon as that starts to get boring, bam, cut right back again. Also, the Black Ops 2 campaign has probably my favorite COD villain for its main antagonist ever, maybe besides Makarov. Raul Menendez is such a well-developed and memorable character that throughout the course of the missions, you get to learn why he's so twisted and evil. And to some extent, you're forced to empathize with him and even feel sorry for him at times, despite being a horrible monster. The mission where you play as him just after Noriega breaks you free, the exaggerated realism with the over-the-top blood splatters, the pulsating HUD, and the kind of hilariously ignoring the concept of reloading altogether, it's this like heightened realism, and it's one of those points where you get to understand your enemy's motivations to a level I feel like we don't get very often. Stepping into the shoes of your enemy, even just for a moment, is so effective in making you at least care about the stakes even more. I just think of Vanguard with generic Nazi man who's a bad guy because bad. In Vanguard, the game has to outright tell you not to like this guy, and the heroes are just perfect saints, basically. They may as well be superheroes with no real depth. A much more interesting protagonist is also one that struggles against the conflict within his or herself, as well as fighting the external threat. And wrestling with that instead of doing the right thing all the time at every possible moment is far more interesting. In Black Ops 2, the way that you see Raul Menendez will alter your treatment of him later on. And that brings me to why, besides pretty good storytelling, the Black Ops 2 campaign is great. The multiple outcomes and the player's choice having genuine weight to it, this is the only COD campaign that has a deep emphasis on player choice. One criticism I have for COD campaigns in general is, in a lot of ways, they're just very on the rails, boxed in, almost interactive movies. You're just watching a story unfold instead of actively participating in it. And don't get me wrong, that's fine. I genuinely have nothing against that style of storytelling in Call of Duty, My point is, Black Ops 2 genuinely tried something different, and it paid off in a great way. There's the obvious choices like, should I kill this guy on the spot or not, or the famous shooting Mason in the leg instead of the head, but in order to get the best possible ending, you have to do random things as well, like grab an offhand document in a random mission, and even avoiding a pipe spewing fire so your boy doesn't get his face burned off. Just small and subtle choices like that dramatically affect the outcome. This is perhaps the strongest aspect to this campaign. You feel so much more personally invested in it, and you consider your actions much more carefully than normal. The scene where you're on the boat and people start getting shot, there's like 934 outcomes of this scenario depending on what you do prior to that mission, and it's actually very unlikely that most people who played the BO2 campaign ever got the best ending at all unless they did the very specific things you need to do during the playthrough, or they did multiple playthroughs, which is exactly what Treyarch intended for it. It's not all perfect though. There was a new element added called Strike Force missions. Now technically these are all optional, but in order to get a good outcome, you have to complete all of these missions. And I'm gonna be real, these are all boring and terrible disasters. Basically, they completely divert from the main story being told, and the gameplay is more like an RTS game where you do basic objectives and control a squad from the top down that I just find mind-numbingly boring personally. I just wanted to blow through them as quickly as possible to get back to the good stuff, but I had to do them to get the good ending. They just don't really seem to fit well from a story or gameplay perspective with what the rest of BO2 was going for, and honestly, it mostly feels like filler, as the total length, actually, of the campaign isn't all that long. There's also a traditional create a class system for the campaign, and while I can appreciate it, there's some neat special weapons you get access to from it. The choice of weaponry matters zero in the grand scheme of things. It's just so you can use your preferred weapon and nothing more. There's a lot of neat little details I noticed as I was replaying it too. When you shoot Mason so that it isn't a lethal shot, you can see a really small mouth movement just before it fades to black, indicating that he's still alive, but it happens so quickly that you'll probably miss it if you're not looking for it. Also, I find it hilarious how apparently everyone in this game is a short king, I guess. According to the game, Chloe, or Karma, is 5'2" and 95 pounds. And when you see her standing next to any other character, she's just as tall, if not taller, than everyone else. Some of the tech abilities they use do feel kind of quaint, corny, or, I don't know, outdated, but honestly, not as much as you'd expect for a 10-year-old game. Most things still feel somewhat plausible or in touch. It also doesn't overstay its welcome. Some COD campaigns I feel like seem to drag on, and it's like they tried to stretch total running time in exchange for an engaging experience. Black Ops 2, aside from the strike missions, has no fluff, cuts right to the chase, and gets you what you need to know. And above all else, is just a genuinely fun single-player experience. The gameplay is about what you'd expect, you know, it's clearing levels as you shoot through bad guys, but occasionally you have to make a choice that are all fun to consider. It's satisfying either killing or capturing Menendez, or seeing Woods and Mason reunite at the very end. It's a nice moment that feels earned given the choices you had to make so it would happen. The Black Ops 2 campaign will probably genuinely stick with me for the rest of my life. It's not the most genius or well-written story or anything, but it's so memorable for a lot of reasons, and it absolutely stands out among the series as an excellent COD campaign, and I sincerely hope they make this branching story structure again. I know they did in Cold War, it's got multiple endings, and I liked that campaign a lot too, but it didn't have the nuances in the choices like BO2 had. Not to mention, the campaign made a great basis and premise for the iconic multiplayer experience, so let's talk about that too, shall we?
Being
Black Ops 2, in all honesty, might be Treyarch's one of, if not the best multiplayer experience. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect or flawless, in fact, far from it, but again, a lot of its imperfections are what make it beautiful and memorable, so let's just dive in, yeah? What exactly is it that makes the multiplayer of Black Ops 2 so damn good? To me, not only is the game absolutely overflowing with personality, but it also rides the line between fun and balanced the best in my opinion. So let's start with that. I think, generally speaking, you can place COD MPs on a spectrum. On one end, you have just pure chaotic fun, where everything's broken from a technical and balance standpoint, but at least it's fun. Classic example I always use is Modern Warfare 2. On the other hand, you have ultra meticulous balance and good technical gameplay. I don't know if there's a great COD example for this, but something like Counter-Strike or even some older Halo games' focus was on ultra fair balance. But either way, you get the point. Black Ops 2 was able to be balanced, for the most part, without losing its fun factor. A perfectly balanced game runs into the danger of becoming boring, and Black Ops 2 avoids this in very intelligent ways. So what do I mean by that? BO2, again, for the most part, strikes a near perfect balance with its weapons and perks. Each weapon, and therefore attachment, have a play and counterplay to them. Also, to me, the Pick 10 system seems to make the most sense in this game. There are just enough items and perks to use without feeling like filler, but still having ample, meaningful changes you can make to your classes. And I can't quite put my finger on it, but something about how the guns sound, feel, and the overall gunplay just feels so damn good in this game, and it doesn't get old. The maps are also, with a few exceptions, super well designed classic COD 3-lane style maps, with their own unique flavor of gameplay to each one. The maps were all designed as well with the sandbox specifically of Black Ops 2's weapons in mind. And something I've noticed, I'm sure many of you will relate to what I'm about to say, but I swear, in older games like Black Ops 2 multiplayer, I can remember in detail the names of MP maps. I know how they look and feel, and they left a big impression on me. Same with the weapon selection. I could probably name you every gun in each class in Black Ops 2 without looking at them, genuinely, and I don't really know why that is. Everything about this game hangs very vividly in my memory, and I don't understand. Maybe my brain has reached max capacity for remembering COD guns and maps, but I would say like after Infinite Warfare specifically, I could no longer retain the names and images of maps and guns in my mind. They all started to blend together at a certain point, but with BO2, there's no mistaking something like Raid or Nuketown 2025 or Hijacked. In fact, now that I think about it, Black Ops 2 was basically the last Treyarch game to have its MP maps reimagined for new COD projects, you know what I mean? In BO4 and Cold War, there are a bunch of Black Ops 2 maps, and even BO1 in each game brought over. Nothing original from BO3 and then on, obviously because of its movement system, even in BO4 have been remastered. Point is, they're all from older COD games like BO1 and 2. It's what people remember most and like playing. And let me ask you a question. What sticks out in your memory more? Slums or Morocco? Or how about Standoff in BO2 or Arsenal in BO4? I understand that's a bit subjective, but I really do feel like COD maps don't have the same remembrance power in our minds these days. Same with weapons, generally speaking, as well. And when it comes to attachments, I also give BO2 MP some credit. It has enough attachments and gives you a fair amount of freedom to experiment with them without feeling like filler. Again, the new COD attachment system is interesting, and I think Modern Warfare 2019 personally does it best, but I'm thinking like in Vanguard, the 80 different variants of attachments that realistically 90% of them never get used, and they certainly aren't memorable at all like the ones in BO2 are. Every single weapon, map, attachment, equipment, and so on, they all have their place in this game. And again, I'm not saying the gameplay balance is perfect. In fact, you don't even want it to be. But the most broken aspects of BO2 MP by far is within the score streaks. Black Ops 2 was also the first game to innovate on the core defining element of MP. The killstreak system has been slightly modified to reward objective players as well, instead of those just farming for kills. I think the score streak system itself is great, and it makes perfect sense for Black Ops 2 MP. The score streaks themselves are where the broken elements come into play, and that's not even really a criticism. The BO2 score streaks are just plain overpowered, some of them, and once you get streaks rolling in BO2, it's like the most fun COD experience there is. If you're getting streaked on, though, it's also like the worst to be on the receiving end of it. That's the duality, though, you have to consider. You want fun kill streaks? Then you have to accept sometimes it's going to suck to play against them. I don't even really consider this a fault of BO2, and I think the score streaks in some sense are really what made the game stand out. And all of that was just to do with sheer gameplay, which by this point I hope I've made it abundantly clear that it's just pure classic handcrafted fun. But the same game is also just literally overflowing with personality. First off, game modes like Gun Game, One in the Chamber, and those kinds of party games were so smart to have in the rotation. Also, the game had a fully functioning theater mode that allowed you to record your games, upload clips to the public board that the rest of the player base could see, allow you to make videos of literally whatever you wanted. There was so much creativity that came out of that aspect alone. Also, I'm just going to say it, I miss Emblem Editor so much. The sheer creativity as well of BO2 emblems are unmatched. You could browse community emblems, and there was even a whole section of YouTube tutorials dedicated to making emblem art. I swear to God, some nights I would spend more time working on and perfecting an emblem than I would spend playing the actual game. Unfortunately though, I don't think we'll ever see this feature again. Now emblems come pre-packaged, and they just don't have the same flair or sauce to them anymore. I'd argue the same with calling cards too. Granted, some people did abuse the emblem system as well to some degree, but it certainly wasn't the majority of people, and they also found a way to monetize emblems, so sadly, I don't think we'll ever see that again. Speaking of monetization, there was some bundle in Vanguard that came out not too long ago with a gun and a few other things, ironically an emblem, that cost $40, literally more than half the price of the full game, and you only get the blueprint for that specific weapon. In BO2, there are some great camos that you can apply to every gun in the entire game with no exceptions for, get this, a grand total, wait for it, of a whopping, a massive $2 whole. Yeah, just let that soak in for a minute.
So,
Just like the guns and maps, the DLC camos are almost all inspired and incredibly memorable. Probably the most consumer-friendly version of this dynamic that's ever existed. And it's not just modern COD that this has affected though. This system started to get way out of hand all the way back in Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, but that's a discussion for another time. My point is, while the gameplay has its flaws, things like lag compensation I remember people weren't too happy about, the lanky hit detection, skill-based matchmaking, which I don't personally believe is the boogeyman everybody makes it out to be, but again, that's an entirely different topic for another time. But also, you know, broken guns here and there occasionally and so on. Black Ops 2's MP is generally regarded as one of the most fun and fair multiplayer experiences to date. Not to mention, the personality and identity was impossible to ignore. Just like the campaign, BO2 multiplayer will probably stick with me forever as well. Very fond memories of it even to this day, and just a great gameplay experience that does hold up with time.
Black Ops 2 multiplayer has a lot of new things
where we did some very simple things to make the game
Now, we come to the point of the video that I've been really excited for. This is obviously where my wheelhouse is, and I've been wanting to talk about Black Ops 2 Zombies for a while, and it's complicated, so stick with me. Black Ops 2 Zombies is memorable because it has some of the worst offerings in zombies ever, combined with some of the best, but it's not that simple. You'd be led to think, based on that logic alone, Black Ops 2 Zombies would be a pretty below average game in terms of zombies if you only looked at that element. But as is with most things in life, it's way more complicated than that. So let's start with a bit of history about Black Ops 2 Zombies. This project was primarily headed by Jimmy Zielinski in the beginning, who is also responsible for many of your favorite maps in Black Ops 1. In BO2, they set out to change the zombies formula by no longer having you in a confined space, but retaining the core gameplay loop, but allowing you to traverse a more open world, and the way they talk about it, you can see what they probably envisioned.
Hey, guess what? Here's your map and here's the walls.
Yeah.
The idea is to say, you know, as far as you need to go or would want to go, to do the things you'd want to do and discover all the story elements and things that you can find that actually help your gameplay, and as far as like actually constructing things out of junk you find in the environment, you know, that doesn't happen in one map because you can just run across the map in half a round and get that. We needed to give them multiple locations around, you know, a very expansive area, and then, you know, on foot, dangerous. A vehicle is going to be a little more protection, so we wanted to give them kind of choices of how to
until the
how to actually
zombies
approach
attack.
that.
It sounds cool on paper, but it's also worth noting that the development of Transit in this case was also held back much by the hardware limitations at the time. Developing for both the PS3 and the Xbox 360, what they actually wanted to do with Transit just wasn't technologically possible given that hardware, despite them giving it their best shot. In fact, the entire reason that denizens and the fog in between areas even exist at all is to slow the player up so the map can load in front of them. Jimmy Z, I'm sure, had good intentions for what Transit should have been. There were even entire areas that had to be cut from Transit, and even features and whole game modes that were scrapped as a result. The engine at the time simply could not support the full version of what Treyarch intended, and they cobbled together what they could for this on-disc experience. So it's obvious at this point Transit is indeed objectively a bad map. But why does everybody remember it so well? In contrast, Duran Fong in Vanguard is also extraordinarily bad, but it doesn't even have 1% of the remembrance power that Transit does. Why not, though? And I want to make this point crystal clear. Something can be objectively poorly designed, yet still be fun, whereas the opposite can also be true. Something can be objectively designed very well, yet still lack any real fun. Transit falls into the category of the former, where its design, yes, is fundamentally very flawed, yet most people can recall some of their favorite zombies memories and moments on this very map. In fact, it's part of its scuffed nature that make it a blast to play with friends. Let me explain what I mean with an example. The Pack-a-Punch system in Transit requires you to place a turbine at the bottom of the power station. In solo, this can be a real pain in the ass because the zombies can still lock on and break that turbine while you're running to the bank safe to get the door open below. If you don't make it in time, the door stays shut and you have to go get another turbine, place it down, try the whole thing again. In co-op, you need to coordinate when somebody is placing a turbine and get somebody else down there on the opposite side of the room in the bank to keep it open. This adds the element of cooperation required to achieve that goal. Also, the fact that fast travel portals are entirely random, there's no way to guarantee you can revive someone if they go down on the farthest end of the map. If you get lucky, sure, but it's no guarantee. Again, this is bad gameplay, but admittedly something that makes it more fun. One general test I like to use as a marker to determine if a map has a good layout design is if hypothetically a teammate downed on the farthest point on the map away from you, could you still revive them before time runs out? If the answer is no, it's not a good signal. Transit doesn't make this guarantee. In Shadows of Evil, it's a big map and somebody going down on the other end can mean game over. But you use the beast mode sites, you can reach anyone anywhere on the map and revive them because of the increased speed that it grants you. It's clever. Transit doesn't really have that level of foresight, but that's fine. That's the beautiful part of Transit. It does, however, have Tombstone, which allows you to reclaim your weapons and perks after death and respawning the next round, which is helpful, granted. It's just that it's fascinating because there's no right way to play Transit. Most of the buildables have multiple use cases, such as using the ladder for the bus, or you can use it on the diner to get the Galvanuckles. Jimmy Z maps in general, and especially Transit, are truly the most open, free-form sandbox maps we have ever seen in zombies. There is hardly any structure to the gameplay loop at all. You load up Transit either solo or with your buddies, and you never quite get the same experience twice. Not to mention, it's also where the storyline really started to grip me, oddly enough, and I can tell you exactly why. Okay, so I've made the case in the past that the reason the Chaos story didn't captivate players in the same way was because despite maybe being a good story, it's a story being told to us, where in the era of BO1 and BO2, I felt like it was more like we were writing the story alongside Treyarch through our theorizing and speculating. And after doing some digging, that is literally true.
I mean, it literally is we bounce back and forth with the community. It is,
Right.
It is us, it is them, it is things we hear them say or think that is in the game, and then we can spin those ideas back with them. We can put ideas out and just see how they react to them, and it's really actually kind of a relationship. We never really meet face to face necessarily, but we are watching what they're doing out there and listening to how they respond to the things that we put in there. So.
Transit really became the most enigmatic map in terms of looking for new things and having such a mysterious aura around its unanswered questions. Like, nobody really knew if Bus Route B was real or not, or how to get there. The Transit horse, if you recall that, the night bus, Jimmy Z even saying Transit has a unique ending besides just death. The Nevada site, different bus routes, opening the bowling area alley, and so on. Man, even the secret radios that had to be interacted with in a very specific way to hear them, these had such a captivating and thought-provoking energy to them that you could do nothing but speculate after, which is kind of why I got interested in the zombie storyline in the first place.
What's that? Who's there? Yes, I can hear you. Fresh? Of course I have. There's nothing else. No, I won't do that. How do I know you're not lying? You could be making all that up.
This was the home and birthplace to so many theories and ideas that got the community invested, and while most of them ended up being just baseless rumors, it kept us gripped at the possibilities the whole time. The Easter egg and Jimmy Z BO2 maps all have two different sides to the quest with slightly altered steps depending on which path you choose. You can either choose to serve Maxis and power the pylons in his favor using the nav card table, which that as a concept on its own was quite cool, or serve Richthofen and do the same with the tables. Either way, Jimmy Z maps and the Easter eggs on them have such weird steps that not all of them are good, I'd argue, but they're all so different to say something positive, and Transit did so much more than just be a bad map. Yes, it was scuffed, but it was beautiful because there was nothing quite like it at the time, and that's what scares me a little bit about a Transit remaster potentially. I think they'd have to clean up a lot of the broken elements of what made Transit special, and it may not have the same interesting aura that original Transit always had. And I remember quite vividly that at the time, mostly everyone hated Transit for the obvious flaws, still unaware that they would look back on the map very fondly later on as time would pass because they had such good times with their buddies. People miss the good times, not the map, I assure you. Black Ops 2 wasn't setting the year off with the best foot exactly, and that trend would continue with Die Rise. So, Die Rise is also a complicated discussion, basically has the same core design and therefore core weaknesses and strengths Transit had. Die Rise opted for, instead of a large flat open world, a more vertical and multi-floor based design, which pretty much captured the same feel, I'd argue, and the revive test thing I was talking about earlier still applies here. There are some impossible to reach spots in time if you get unlucky, to a point where they even developed an entire perk to mitigate this problem. Who's Who is essentially is what allowed you to spawn a vulnerable ghost version of yourself that you can, revive yourself in a pinch, and that's really all it does. Again, on paper, the perk is useful, but it actually ends up being realistically more of a liability than anything else. Die Rise's layout is absolutely horrendous, and I won't even hold back on that. It's like bafflingly bad. Not to mention, there's a massive amount of wasted areas and space that realistically don't even need to be there. The Easter egg is some of the most weird and random steps I've ever seen in a quest, and to this day, I still couldn't explain to you exactly how the Mahjong tile step works in this map 10 years later. Die Rise also still features some buildables, albeit way less than what was available in Transit, and has one of the most famous Treyarch trolls of all time. The PhD flopper machine, which, ironically would be insanely useful on this map to mitigate fall damage, is actually not attainable on Die Rise, even though everyone thought there was some way to acquire this though, and tried tirelessly to make it happen. Similar to Transit, it had all of the theory crafting and mysterious aura around its unanswered questions as well. There are some TVs that you have to interact with, again, in a super specific way so that you can get its message, and it adds to the creepy and unsettling vibe of Die Rise.
Attention all on this channel. This is George Barkley, former assistant director of the CDC facility in Druid Hills, Georgia. Prior to the destruction of our headquarters, our research found evidence that contaminants are now infecting the very air we breathe. As such, exposure of some sort appears inevitable for all survivors.
The Slickofire Wonder Weapon was also great for the Die Rise sandbox formula. Basically a broken slip and slide that can kill zombies and affect movement and cause them to stumble around, which, while on tall buildings you can see how that was intended to be a hazard. Interestingly, similar to how Town exists in relation to Transit as a small survival map, Die Rise originally was going to have a streets level survival map alongside it too. This never got past early development though, for unknown reasons, but still, this would have been super interesting to at least see. There's a few ways Die Rise I think could be dramatically improved in its gameplay, and am I suggesting these fixes for a potential remaster? No, but I'll lay them out anyways. First of all, make the elevators still move on their own, but also work on a manual call button. You know, like kind of like how a real elevator works. I know there's a key item in Die Rise that does this, but it's a one-time use and it's not nearly enough. Also, rework Who's Who to have the ghost have increased health and revive speed so that you can pick yourself up. Also, clean up the fall damage areas to make them feel a bit more consistent, and also make it so one player can carry more than just one buildable part at a time. And finally, tighten up some of the areas that don't get used to optimize the more important ones. There, just a few suggestions that can make the map less painful, but still keeping most of what made it fun and memorable. Die Rise has some really neat ideas, don't get me wrong. I really like how if you kill all the jumping jacks without missing a bullet, or you use melee or traps only, you get a free perk alongside a max ammo each time. I like how this particular armored zombie model has a little bit more health on round 1, so it's not a one knife. It's a completely unnecessary detail, but it makes sense. I like how there are some skill jumps and a perfect timing to consider when going down some elevators. I like the general atmosphere of the map as well, and it certainly has a unique flavor to it, but as I've stated, it has many pain points within the gameplay. But just like Transit, people hated this map initially. It was a big 0-2 for Treyarch so far, but now some people still look back on it very fondly. But Black Ops 2 was about to make some massive changes to its direction, in the form of a new director creatively for their maps. But before we go there, I want to take a quick detour to some of the things that made Black Ops 2's gameplay very special besides just its maps. Some of these only apply to Jimmy's maps, but Perma-perks are one of my favorite concepts ever. Basically, these are small bonuses that you can get in-game by doing certain actions. For example, rebuilding enough barriers in a short amount of time grants you the metal barriers bonus, which takes zombies way longer to pull down. Or dying with quick revive and reviving a certain number of times grants you the perma-tombstone perk, i.e. you keep all of your perks except quick revive after you go down. This is massively helpful. The game does not explain to you how these work at all, which I think is a good thing. All you get is a green flash for a second, and you have to consider the last interaction you just had and try to determine what perma-perk you got and what it does. And these can also be lost as well via certain methods, so you have to be mindful of what perma-perks are currently in effect or not. It's so fun, and honestly, I like a system like this far better than choosing perks out of a menu like in BO4, or just upgrading them once and never thinking about them again like in Cold War. Also, the leaderboard system is so simple, yet somehow Treyarch has failed time and again to have any leaderboards this intuitive. It's so easy to see highest rounds, most kills, and it even divides them by number of players. It's very well organized, and we can't talk about the leaderboards without also discussing the ranking system. BO2 Zombies ranks are infamous for not being well understood. In fact, there's a perma-perk that requires you to buy the same M14 wall buy or Olympia a certain number of times, granting you a ray gun eventually, and that is only possible within the first 2 rankings of BO2. If you're a one bone or a crossbone rank only, then there's the skull, which is like, I guess, middle of the pack. You have knife, which are above average players, and then shotguns for the elite video gamers, and blue eyes on all of these skull icons to indicate consecutive days played. This system wasn't perfect, but it did give you a general indication of how good players in your lobby were, and this was important because I also think BO2 was the last Zombies game to have true public matches. In Black Ops 3 onward, in my opinion, it was far more common to play with an organized party or just go solo than it was to play with randoms, and there's reasons for that I don't have time to get into, but it still was the case. So even besides just the maps, there were so many special elements BO2 already had going for it, not to mention modes like 4v4 grief mode and turned that let you play as the zombie. But all that stuff considered, There were also some cut content, apparently, that would have probably came to the game had Jimmy Zielinski stayed in charge. Some World at War remasters were planned for Black Ops 2, namely things like Die Rise and perhaps even Nocturne Toten, that were probably prototyped for BO2 but never actually saw a release. And I think the reason primarily is because they shifted direction and really the course of Zombies Forever with DLC 2 Mob of the Dead. So, here we go. Mob of the Dead. This map would not just only change the course of Black Ops 2 Zombies, but Call of Duty Zombies as a whole, forever. This was the first introduction into what we're going to call the Blundell era of maps, since Jimmy Z was no longer the main creative direction for this project. That went to Jason Blundell. Now, honestly, I don't know much about why exactly midway through Black Ops 2, Treyarch changed directors for Zombies maps, but if I had to take a guess, it was probably because of the relatively poor reception of both Transit and Die Rise at the time. BO2 Zombies was in dire straits, and Mob of the Dead represented a new way of doing things. Not only is the setting and premise of Mob unbelievably cool, but its gameplay would also hard shift direction from the Jimmy Z formula of maps as well, taking almost the exact opposite approach when it comes to gameplay structure. But let's talk about the setting first. This was the first map in Black Ops 2 to have a celebrity cast and to not be the generic crew or the transit crew we've been playing in the story so far. The story essentially is that there are these 4 mobsters stuck on the real Alcatraz Island while in an infinite loop in purgatory to atone for their sins. Only by breaking the cycle may they be set free. It was also such a hard shift in story up to this point where we've been following the Victus crew and, their dealings with Richtofen through Transit and Die Rise, and Mob of the Dead comes along, and we're honestly not even sure if these even take place in the same universe. However, if you listen to the dialogue carefully, you discover that they reference people like Nikolai and others, indicating that this is still somehow related to the things we've been playing already. Up to us to put together the clues about that. I give Mob of the Dead an A+ for setting and atmosphere and story alone, but its gameplay is also something I find exceptional as well. Jimmy Z maps up to this point, for all intents and purposes, have been giant sandboxes with no real clear direction or goal other than just survive. Sure, they have their main Easter egg, but they're basically just survival maps. They're wide open in terms of structure and how the player can interact with it. Mob of the Dead, on the other hand, is very expertly crafted in a single direction. Right off the bat, you spawn in Afterlife telling the player 2 things. Number 1, this is a new mechanic to get used to, and number 2, there are some things only accessible using this mode, with a double points door that can be unlocked if you're clever enough and paying attention. Within the first 5 seconds of a match, the player is already given information without them even knowing. Second, the literal pictures on the wall, the dialogue of the characters, and even the HUD all indicate that you need to find and gather plane parts to escape from the roof. First minute of the gameplay and you already have an objective. First 2 minutes of gameplay, you open doors and discover a dog on the wall that literally eats zombies. So naturally you feed it until it disappears. No reward is given to the player at this point though, prompting the player to look for more of these. And 5 minutes into gameplay, you've stumbled across the plane parts and you've used Afterlife mechanics to obtain them. I won't go any further, but you get the point. The game is like right away, hey, go grab this thing and use it over here on this other thing and use it over here and you'll get rewarded. It's like this very intentional pathway for player progression, which is like the complete opposite approach to Jimmy. And mostly everyone responded positively to this new take on zombies gameplay. The Easter egg also has a proper ending as opposed to the other BO2 maps before it. As the very last step of the main quest, you go to the rooftop and battle it out with a friend, and you turn on each other, and depending on who's playing as Albert Arlington or the Weasel will determine whether the cycle continues or is broken. Mob of the Dead also is one of the best maps in my opinion at giving the player ample choices to progress further, but not punishing you if you don't. So what does that mean exactly? Well, for starters, you can craft the acid gat kit for the wonder weapon, but don't have to, and it's a solid shotgun on its own. You can get the golden spork from the bathtub that can one knife zombies until like round 34, but you also don't have to if you don't want to. You can upgrade the Tomahawk or the Hell's Retriever into the Redeemer version, but you absolutely don't have to do that as well, and it's kind of a pain, so I wouldn't recommend it. But these are just fun side things to go for as well, so that the experience of Mob doesn't have to feel the same every time, because that can happen. As much as this structured experience is good, it does have a downside. Often, the early game of these maps and the setup feels basically the same every single time, but it doesn't hurt Mob too much in my eyes. Also, remember how I said earlier that Transit was restricted due to the hardware limitations at the time? Well, so was Mob. Originally, Treyarch wanted to do basically the whole of Alcatraz Island and prison, but it was just simply too much. And so this is where the real genius of Mob is in my eyes. They just straight up cut out anything that didn't need to be there, and basically the restrictions made them tighten up all the areas they kept in. There's pretty much no wasted space on Mob, and they had to cut out all the unnecessary fat of the map. They optimized Mob because of the limitations instead of making huge sacrifices to try to make it work like is the case of Transit. Again, Mob is no perfect map either. In fact, in terms of substance, I think the main quest is a little on the thin side, but that's just me. It's not a deal breaker, but it is something I've noticed. It's, however, chock full of plenty of cool side Easter eggs that aren't even needed, but they add a little something special to the map.
Not this time.
I find myself still playing Mob even to this day and enjoy it as much as I did when it first came out. High rounds are incredibly fun, the Easter eggs very enjoyable to replay and do over again, and it's just an outstanding map and an excellent piece that saved Black Ops 2 Zombies at that point in time, and that would lead into DLC 3, that would be Jimmy Zielinski's last map, Buried. So this brings us to our boy Buried. This map would famously be Jimmy Z's final Zombies map at Treyarch, and in my opinion is the only map in BO2 that really nailed the sandbox gameplay that I think he was going for. And as far as settings go, this is located in an old western town, shifted under the tectonic plates of the earth to end up somewhere in Angola, Africa. And just the atmosphere and like the setting alone is worth talking about. Being an old rundown western town probably by itself would have been enough, but shove that all underground and you have the setup for a super unique setting. Buried also has one of the more interesting spawn rooms as well. You have this upper railing with a skill jump LSAT wallby that you can only get if you don't screw up the jump, otherwise it throws you right into the map. And you need to jump down that pit anyways to get to the actual buried part of the town. Now, again, because this is a Jimmy map, there's little to no structure at all in terms of how the player approaches things. You're basically free to explore any way you want up to a certain point in which you realize there are some barricades that can't be opened by traditional means. Instead, eventually you encounter Leroy in his cell, or Arthur or whatever. And then you open his cage and realize you can give him booze and he will break down these barricades for you. Give him candy and he can build traps for you, lock down the mystery box for the entire game, hold a crawler, and so much more. But the game doesn't tell you this stuff. The game only lets you know what he's capable of through experimentation. He alone adds so much flair and personality to the map. Like, what even are you, my guy? You're like 9 feet tall, still keep a fresh cut despite being alone in jail. It's so interesting, man, and it's just another one of those iconic and memorable pieces of Black Ops 2. The amount of buildable items alone is impressive, and the main Easter egg actually feels somewhat coherent for a Jimmy Z map in Buried. There are still some steps that just genuinely make no sense, like the colored levers, for example. A lot of people think the order of them and the way you must hit them is indicated by the color on the candy jars, but this is just completely untrue. But many people bought a lot of these urban legends and myths associated with Buried because they were kind of hard to disprove. In any case, Buried also introduced a large number of some of the most broken weapons ever in COD Zombies, namely in the form of the Paralyzer Wonder Weapon with infinite ammo and the ability to fly and glide around the map with it. Also, the Ray Gun Mark II was added with this DLC, and it was retroactively added to the box of all maps before it as well. The Witch's House that is required to get through to obtain Pack-a-Punch is responsible for some of the most iconic imagery in Buried, and these actually have a basis in real-life lore as well, which I won't get into, but it's extremely fascinating. Buried is really the only map that nailed it, in my opinion, for having that fun sandbox gameplay without being terrible. It also housed the first ever Zombies super Easter egg, so if you had done all the Easter eggs prior for a specific person, either Maxis or Richtofen before it, all players in your party could activate this box and listen to an ending take place depending on which side you gave power to. Also, new and unique bonuses would be applied to the player's game after activating this, such as the ability to carry 4 wonder weapons or a permanent fire sale, stuff like that. Above all else, Buried is one of the most charming maps out there, and is aged well and playable even to this day. I do take some issues with Buried, but most of them come from the fact that all of the gameplay is so loose and unstructured, but they're minor in comparison and not even really worth discussing. All in all, solid Zombies map and an absolute icon in its own right, and as previously stated, this would be Jimmy's final map with Treyarch, but Black Ops 2 still had one map to go, and that was the monumental, groundbreaking map that was Origins. So, Origins would be the final installment in the Black Ops 2 Zombies offering, and did it ever end with a bang? You know, in my eyes, the only DLC for Treyarch maps that have ever really nailed it are Moon and Origins. Everything else kind of fell flat or was just sort of mid on its own compared to the maps that came before it. Origins, at the time of its release, was earth-shattering. We had never seen anything quite like it. This also reintroduced to us the new version of our original Zombies crew, which a lot of the community were missing, you know, because we haven't played them since Black Ops 1. Tank, Richtofen, Nikolai, and Takio were reintroduced to us, but albeit this time a little different. The setting involves the three honing in on Richtofen for capture on the battlefields of World War I in northern France, but quickly discover that the area has been overrun by the undead. The crew that we now know as Primus must work together to survive. Thematically, Origins is one of my favorite, and I've explained this before, but I think Origins visually represents what Zombies is. You've got the upper portion of the map being a dull, dreary, and depressing set of trenches to represent the monotonous part of Zombies gameplay. Shooting zombies and, rebuilding barriers, etc. Then you have the crazy place that exists as a visual indicator of the secret depth of each Zombies map and what those hold. Figuratively and literally, Origins is a traditional survival map with a insane hidden quest underneath the surface, and just like with Mob of the Dead, Jason Blundell would expand on that structured formula for Origins as well. This map generally guides the player along to turn on generators, discover the Pack-a-Punch machine, and by that point you'll likely have discovered the gramophone to open the lower half of the excavation site. At that point, you're free to do technically whatever you like, but the game does nudge at you and hint for you to build the staves of the ancients. Origins also broke new ground at the time by introducing the concept of 4 unique wonder weapons for each player, whereas before, generally speaking, there were only 1 to 2 wonder weapons available per map. The staves are all unique and have slightly different functions, but are all great when you know how to use them. Some are for sure better than others, and some are also built for offensive play, while some do much better as a defensive play style. But all things considered, the upgraded ice staff is still by far the best one. Origins took massive risks in terms of how the player operates in it. They also introduced a mini-boss enemy, the Panzer Soldat, that is one of the most intimidating mini-bosses in the entire franchise. This dude will grab you from 80 feet away, toast you, then butter you up and call it a day with no remorse. He's got a few balance issues that I would complain about, but all things considered, I think he's still a great fit to Origins, and he actually feels like he has an intimidating presence when entering the map. Each player flinches a little bit inside whenever this dude spawns in, or hears the siren. Now, Origins is an amazing map in almost every way, and it's a top-tier map within the series, I'd argue, but it's not without its flaws as well. First off, to do the main Easter egg, each staff has to be built and upgraded. In 4-player, this is fine, and actually quite straightforward and fast to do. In solo, though, this can get tedious, and it's worth noting that Treyarch fully intended Origins and the Easter egg to be only doable with 4 players, but eventually solo players figured out a way that they can hit the button inside the robot and still use the special grenade you get to break the seal, and that entire system makes it possible in a small window for you to be able to solo this Easter egg. Besides getting and upgrading all the staves, there's pretty much like 2 other real Easter egg steps that are extremely quick and simple. So it's not the best solo Easter egg, but it's doable and it's still a great experience co-op. And also, Origins doesn't have the best layout. This has mostly to do with the gramophone system, where there's only one active portal at a time, and if you forget the gramophone, you have to run all the way back to the tunnel it was at, then run all the way back again to the one you actually needed to go through. This could have been mitigated, I think, by leaving the portals active once you've activated them one time around already. Also, I was never really a huge fan of having to go back and save the generators from the Templar zombies being disabled every couple of rounds. That combined with panzers spawning in, it can be a little much at times, and either way, high rounds are extremely fun on Origins. The Easter egg, while again not great solo, is still an enjoyable experience, and it's ton of fun co-op, and also, the fact of the matter is it's got ton of fun side Easter eggs and interesting things to discover literally every time you play. It's like Shadows of Evil in that manner. I feel like I notice something new in Origins every time I play it, even now, even if it's not anything super crazy. With one of the most controversial Easter egg ending cutscenes of all time, it's safe to say that Zombies was at least back on the map for a lot of people, and Origins alone provides great gameplay challenges for, casuals and hardcore players alike, even to this day. Now, you might conclude that the Zombies era in Black Ops 2 was dominated by Blundell, and generally speaking, I do think most people preferred his maps in this game, but with that said, Black Ops 2 would have been a lesser game with either of them having full control. Because of their vastly different approaches, both Jimmy maps and Jason maps have a distinct feel and flavor to them, where Jimmy is chaos, Jason is order. Where Jimmy is yin, Jason is yang. Looking back, I'm glad we had both of these different styles for our maps offering in Black Ops 2 because there was something for everybody. So if you didn't like a particular style of map, you could try the other. BO2 would have certainly been a lesser game without these varieties that these two gentlemen provided in their design, and it felt like each one of them had their own different ideas. Some of them were terrible, yes, but that's why I think Black Ops 2 Zombies is beautiful because of its flaws. Black Ops 2, if nothing else, is truly the complete package. A great single-player experience, and a downright addicting multiplayer, and honestly a massive variety offering in Zombies. And at the end of the day, I'm a firm believer that there will never be another game like Black Ops 2. There were so many things and choices that, set this game apart from the rest, and for a game to age as well as this one, took some real craftsmanship that was exceptionally special. Treyarch had a vision, and while there were some bumps in the road for sure, they executed it to the best of their ability. I think we all got something a little different out of Black Ops 2, but we're all unified in the sense that we have this shared experience together to look very fondly back on.